Well, good morning. It's an honor today to celebrate the Herschel Hobbs Lecture. The Herschel H. Hobbs and Francis J. Hobbs Lectureship in Baptist Faith and Heritage was OBU's first endowed lectureship beginning in the fall of 1980. It is one of the 4 OBU lectureships designed to help students grow in their knowledge of Baptist theology, Baptist history, as well as studies in the Bible and studies in theology. Now, if you don't know, Dr. Herschel Hobbs, for which our Hobbs School of Theology and Ministry is named, was the long-serving pastor of First Baptist Church of Oklahoma City. He is a Baptist icon in the history of Baptists in the 20th century and a faithful Oklahoma Baptist as well. And so part of his estate was given in honor of his legacy to help support the intellectual life of OBU. So friends of the late Dr. Hobbs, as I say, pastor of First Baptist Church of Oklahoma City, and Mrs. Hobbs created this endowed fund in honor of the couple's years of outstanding Christian service. So every year, the Hobbs Lectureship sponsors a lecture here and highlights speakers that share phases and passions of Baptist faith and heritage with the OBU community. The Herschel H. Hobbs School of Theology and Ministry bears his name. We have, if you look at the back of your program, we have an unbelievably distinguished cast of former lecturers here at our university, and this year we add to that grand cast. Dr. Stephen Presley serves as Associate Professor of Church History, as well as the Director of Research, Doctoral Studies at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He's also a Research Fellow at the Center of Religion, Culture, and Democracy and the Center for Baptist Renewal. He's a prolific author in early Christianity, publishing The Intellectual Reception of Genesis 1-3 and Irenaeus of Lyon, published by Brill, which is a publisher overseas. Okay, I think that's probably the best way to say it. Many who don't know what Brill is, it's fine. As well as other articles and essays examining doctrine, practice, and biblical interpretation in early Christianity. He's a friend of this university. He's also passionate about our Lord, and what I like about Dr. Presley is how he unpacks how theology is not something that's dry and dusty that belongs on the shelf, but something that is lived in the life of faith. Theology is alive, and it's meaningful for life and practice. Currently, he's finishing a monograph on cultural engagement in the early church, published by Erdman's, which is a North American publisher, that should be out next year. And the topic of his study for us today derives from that work. So, OBU community, would you join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Presley? Thank you.
I want to say thank you very much, President Thomas, for this opportunity to be here. Also say thank you to Dr. Emerson and, of course, all those who have joined us. I am from Texas, but Oklahoma is near and dear to my heart. I grew up going to Falls Creek with my Baptist youth group, spent many nights camping in eastern Oklahoma, and it is good to be back. I knew many who had come to Bison Hill for education and have an immense respect for this institution and honored to be here. The title of this lecture is Early Christianity as Public Good. In a review essay for the Calvin Theological Journal entitled Abraham Kuyper or Saint Benedict, The Challenge of Christian Cultural Discipleship Today, Professor John Bolt presents us with 2 competing images that are popular today in contemporary discussions of cultural engagement. The first is the illustrious political figure of Abraham Kuyper, who champions an optimistic political theology, political theory of engagement that aims to transform society. This Dutch politician and theologian harnessed the best of the Reformed tradition and presents us with a vision of cultural engagement through political and social means. The other is the 6th century monk, St. Benedict, who composed one of the most famous monastic rules while living in a grotto in Subiaco for 3 years. Around 529, Benedict climbed to the summit of Monte Cassino and established a school for virtue within a distinct community. In our culture, the hope is that some of us may follow Benedict into our local monasteries and begin cultivating small communities that can withstand the onslaught of the barbarian invasions. While it is unfair to both Benedict and Kuyper, if we press these strategies of social engagement to the extremes, the difference is like an army standing before two generals, one shouting charge at the culture, the other leading some in retreat. Bolt argues it's hard to be consistent in this choice between fight or flight. It's not always a simple one. But I think these two figures put the cultural moment in an interesting light and demonstrate the challenging question that we face. How does the church respond to secularization? Now, of course, we know not all secularism is the same. As Charles Taylor taught us, secularism today is not your grandparents' secularism. It has evolved into something altogether different. Rather than rejecting the moral and spiritual concerns, secularism today recognizes their importance, though they are not the same spiritual and moral concerns that emanate from the church's teaching. As postmodern philosopher Jack Caputo argues, we are now embracing religion without religion, or moral concerns without the metaphysical baggage that goes along with them. It is no longer controversial to say that the culture has been moving in this direction for some time. In his recent book on cultural engagement entitled Exiles on Mission, British missiologist Paul Williams remarks that since 1960, most of Western Europe has progressively rejected Christianity, not only in terms of the formal influence of the church upon public life, but also in terms of any perceived cultural contribution of the Christian faith. The difference is that in modernity, the truth of Christianity was rejected. Now it is something just as sinister. The goodness of Christianity. With vanishingly few exceptions, Williams adds, it is now no longer a cultural advantage to be known as a Christian or to engage in God talk in these societies, but rather a positive hindrance to communication and likely to be misunderstood and possibly detrimental to one's own reputation. Within the moral diversity of the moment, Christianity is no longer any positive good or something that should be tolerated. Christianity has a goodness problem. But in this strange cultural turn, I want to suggest that we might find some wisdom and perspective by pausing and reflecting upon the earliest days of the Christian church. As others have observed, this cultural moment in some ways feels actually like a return to the Sitzumleben of the church in the ancient Roman world. British political commentator Ferdinand Mont, for example, writes in his book, Full Circle, how the Roman world came back to us, that our present habits, our enthusiasms, our preoccupations, our worldview don't just carry in them some interesting traces of civilization that crumbled when Rome crumbled. In a weird but exact way, they often reproduce the mindset of Rome under early emperors. In other words, if we look back at the ancient world, we can see, as Mont writes, we are them and they are us. More recently, University of San Diego law professor Stephen Smith made a similar argument in his book, Pagans and Christians at the City. Smith posits that our cultural transformation is a renewed manifestation of the ancient historical struggle between competing religious ideologies that reflected basic existential orientations that could not coexist in peace. By the 4th century, these competing religiosities were in a struggle that ultimately saw Christianity prevail. In our day, the struggle has trended in the opposite direction. And now, modern paganism, as Smith calls it, is imposing its will upon Western culture in a way that is reminiscent of the days of ancient Rome. When we look around us, Christendom is gone, a new world has emerged, and ironically enough, it has the striking feeling of déjà vu. In the first 3 centuries of the church's life, before the ascension of Constantine in the 4th century, the church lived as a marginalized community. There was, of course, episodic persecution and occasional martyrdom that became more widespread as we inched closer to the 4th century. But throughout the ancient world, there was a widespread cultural posture of skepticism and hostility toward the church. Well, I could paint a diverse portrait of the strategies, the methods, the arguments of the 2nd and 3rd century Christian apologists. For this moment, I want to focus on the general sense of the essential goodness of Christianity. In the face of pagan opposition, early Christians claimed that the faith of the church is not just true, but good. This claim to goodness means that the Christian message transforms and promotes human flourishing in a more healthy and holistic way than any alternative. The early church recognized that cultural engagement in society began not with syllogisms or with strategic methods, but with a Christian identity. As a result, they did not remove themselves from the outside world, nor did they absorb the culture unfiltered. Instead, Christians, drawing on the teaching of the Scriptures, defended the beliefs and practice as fundamentally better and more satisfying way of life and a means to promote human flourishing. In this essay, I want to frame this argument for the goodness of church in 2 ways. First, I want to mention the perspective of outsiders. This select group who ridiculed Christianity, denied the positive contribution that it made to the Roman world. And I'll do so we can hear the pagans in their own words as they offer social, political, and intellectual rebukes and rejections of Christianity as a public good. Second, alongside these pagans, I want to focus on 2 arguments of the early church who defended the goodness of Christianity for society. The way they emphasized, first and foremost, the importance of catechesis, discipleship, and liturgy. And number 2, the importance of embeddedness within the culture. First, the outsiders. Evangelism in the ancient world was not overly complicated or overly strategic. It was organic. Through normal daily interactions and casual contacts, the lives of Christians ministered to the world around them, sparked curiosity with non-Christians from those outside the faith. While we know that life in the ancient world was filled with sins and sufferings, the early church offered hope. It offered a loving, harmonious, hospitable community that cared for its own. Many outside the church found this community appealing, though others were threatened. 3 figures that help us catch a glimpse of this posture towards the church include Pliny, the governor of Bithynia, Lucian, a 2nd century rhetorician, and Celsus, a pagan intellectual. First, in order to understand the political perception in the ancient world, we turn to Pliny, the governor of Bithynia. From his own account, Pliny had encountered many converts to the Christian faith and observed the evangelistic work and the spiritual lives that had disrupted the social and the economic activities of his region. He wrote to the Emperor Trajan in the opening of the 2nd century, and he reports that converts to Christianity include many persons of every age, every rank, and both men and women. So these Christians are not neglecting to patronize the temples and refusing to attend the gladiatorial games and avoiding other social practices. Pliny recognized that this contagion of Christianity will not be cured unless legal action against them is taken. The conundrum for Pliny, however, is that these crimes that they have committed, the Christians have committed, are crimes of omission. They refuse to participate in activities within the culture. He doesn't know really what to do with these Christians, which is why he writes to the Emperor Trajan. In his letter, he says, "The sum and substance of their fault is that they had been accustomed to meet on a fixed day, sing a hymn to Christ as God, bind themselves to an oath, not to commit some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, adultery, falsify trust, to refuse to return trust when called upon. When this was over, they departed and partook of food, just ordinary food." When you read it, you can sense Pliny's frustration. He has no real legal standing to kill the Christians, except the grounds of stubbornness and insurrection. These Christians are not conspiring, they are gathering for worship and simply refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods. They take an oath, but an oath to be Christian, Christ-like, kind, merciful. What is shocking to the Roman mind is not that Christians would worship some unusual god or gather in secret meetings. This was common practice for all kinds of political and social organizations in the ancient world. But that they would commit themselves to certain theological and moral convictions and hold their community accountable. Of course, not all Christians were saints and martyrs, as you can read in Pliny's account. But Pliny's account tells us that while Christians were being persecuted, there were many in the public square who found Christian theology and morality appealing. The attraction to the goodness of Christianity was disrupting Roman life. Looking at the public perception, we also find Lucian of Samosata, the rhetorician. Where Pliny offers this civic perspective, Lucian gives us a rhetorical perspective from those entrenched in entertainment. In one comedy entitled The Passing of Peregrinus, he describes the naivete of the Christians and their foolishness. The protagonist of his story, Peregrinus, was a cynic philosopher who was famous for burning himself to death on a pyre at Olympia. Lucian recounts the interesting life of Peregrinus and mentions in passing that during one season he converted to Christianity. He later renounced the faith, but not before he managed to exploit the church for personal and monetary gain. In his account, Lucian mocks the gullibility of Christians because they actually believe Peregrinus' conversion was sincere and came to his aid when he was suffering in prison. This is Lucian's account. Indeed, these people came from cities all over Asia, sent by the Christians at their common expense to defend and encourage our hero. They show incredible speed, these Christians do, whenever any such public action is taken, for in no time they lavish their all. So when it was in the case of Peregrinus, much money came to him by reason of his imprisonment. These poor wretches have convinced themselves, first and foremost, that they're going to be immortal and live for all time. In consequence of this, they despise death and willingly give themselves into custody. Furthermore, their first lawgiver persuaded them that they're all brothers of one another and that they have transgressed once by denying all the Greek gods and worshiping this crucified sophist. Now, if any charlatan or trickster is able to profit, comes among these Christians, he acquires sudden wealth by imposing upon these simple folk. So why are Christians stupid, naive, poor wretches? Because they show mercy to those in prison. When Christians heard that one of their members, Peregrinus, was in need, they came from all over Asia to encourage and defend him. These Christians, according to Lucian, despised their wealth, willingly held things in common. These Christians even show incredible speed at which they take such action. In a very short order, these Christians came to defend one of their own with everything that was at the disposal of the community. Lucian recognizes, however, that the concern for the poor is born of a theological conviction that Christians believe they are going to be immortal and live for all time. As a result, they despise death. Christian views of providence and transcendence and salvation inform their social engagement. The Christian hope of eternal life provides a motivation to give of themselves for the sake of others. However, for this account to be comical, there must be a measure of shared cultural experience with Christians. The very fact that this kind of thinking circulated in the pagan world suggests that there was a common public perception of Christians' unity and generosity and mercy alongside their stupidity. Yet what is intended to be funny and ridiculous, read from a theological perspective, actually demonstrates the extreme mercy and hospitality of Christians. I have no doubt that while some may mock Christians and chuckle at their stupidity, any reader of Lucian who finds themselves locked in prison would not reach out to Lucian. What the passing of Peregrinus teaches us is that the basic contours of Christian theology were circulating in the ancient world, informing their social engagement. Alongside legal and social conflicts, there was Celsus's intellectual critiques. Celsus, a cynic philosopher and a pagan intellectual, composed a well-known work entitled On True Doctrine. This work was so influential that over 50 years later, the church father Origen sat down to address it point by point, composing an 8-volume work known as Contra Celsum, or Against Celsus. Celsus's attacks lack all the playfulness of Lucian, and instead offers a very serious intellectual critique. He assumes that Christians were altogether foolish and stupid, and that only the Greeks are best equipped to judge what passes for truth. Celsus was frustrated that Christian teaching was already circulating. In one account, he describes Christian social engagement and explained how the church informed their moral convictions and evangelistic efforts. He suggests that Christians were deceitful, conniving, cunning bunch who avoided pagan intellectuals and instead snuck around to prey upon the simple and the gullible. Celsus describes the Christian activities saying this: "These Christians display their trickery in the marketplace. They go around begging. They would not dare to enter into conversation with intelligent men or voice their sophisticated beliefs in the presence of the wise. On the other hand, wherever one finds a crowd of adolescent boys, a bunch of slaves, a company of fools, there will be the Christian teachers showing off their fine new philosophy. In private houses, one can see wool workers, cobblers, laundry workers, the most illiterate country bumpkins who would not venture to voice their opinion in front of their intellectual betters. These Christians claim they alone know the right way to live, and if only the children will believe them, they will be happy in their homes, and their homes will be happy as well." Celsus is astonished that Christians make their appeal to the public at large, and that this appeal emphasizes the happiness and the goodness of the church. This is a constant refrain in Celsus that Christians are stupid, unintellectual, from the lower classes, generally comprised of unsavory characters. It baffles Celsus to the point that he goes on to compare the different way that the Greco-Roman mystery religions invite people into their community compared with the way the church invites into their community. Celsus writes that the mystery religions say, whoever has a pure heart, a wise tongue, whoever is free of sin, whoever's soul is pure, if you are righteous and good, come forward, join the mystery religions. But Christians, Celsus writes, Say, whoever is a sinner, whoever is unwise, whoever is childish, yea, whoever is a wretch, his is the kingdom of God. And they invite into their membership those who by their own accounts are sinners. The dishonest, the thieves, the burglars, the blasphemers, the grave robbers. I mean, what community actually invites robbers into their midst? Celsus tells us that Christians seek out those who are humble, hurting, broken, the outcasts, the lowlifes. Like Pliny and Lucian, Celsus rejects any positive contribution from Christians. Throughout his arguments, there's a sense that even at the end of the 2nd century, he can feel the threat that Christianity poses. The exclusivity of their worship, the rejection of the pagan gods, the moral appeal all demonstrate the goodness of the church that is undermining the Roman identity. These reflections help us imagine a world in which Christians lived and served. Turning to the church, we can see 2 key features that help us see their argument for the goodness of the faith and how it shaped their apologetic. First, these ancient Christians understood that the defense of the faith did not begin with a mere strategy, but with an understanding of the Christian identity. In other words, cultural engagement with the pagan world does not begin with political maneuvering or social media campaigns. It begins with a worshiping community that was praying, catechizing, discipling, and striving little by little to be conformed to the likeness of Jesus Christ. Early Christian apologists were just as concerned with cultivating an ecclesiology that discipled Christians in the church's doctrine and morality and framed this teaching in the hope of Christ's eternal kingdom. These points of doctrine were fashioned through the regular practice of catechesis and liturgy that mark out the church and slowly prepare the catechumen to join the faith. Second, when the church turned outward to engage the world, it fostered a political theology and a public theology that was born of a worshiping community, emphasizing purity and persuasion. When the church left their communal gatherings, they did not remove themselves from the culture, nor were they always and in every way overly optimistic about wielding the reins of political power to bring about cultural transformation. They were instead interested in a public and a political theology that aimed to distinguish themselves from the mores of the culture and engage and persuade those around them in word and in deed. The church sought to demonstrate the goodness of Christianity in both the political and the public spheres. Beginning with an early Christian identity, early Christians striving to cultivate a community that was unified by confession, morality, and a common hope. We see this claim in the early 3rd century with Tertullian of Carthage in his famous apology composed of the civic leaders of North Africa. He argues that we shall at once go on to describe the particularities of the Christian society and refute the evil charges against it and demonstrate its positive good. The positive good Tertullian speaks of is what set the church apart, was a community united by a confession or a rule of faith, a spiritually disciplined life, and a common hope of the life of the world to come. These things come together in the 2nd century catechetical manual of Irenaeus of Lyon, entitled On Apostolic Preaching. At the beginning of this one of the earliest catechetical texts that we have, Irenaeus begins with a Christian vision of anthropology and argues that just as the human person is composed of body and soul, so also does the person need to attend to both doctrine and morality. Summarizing these things, Irenaeus writes, since man is composed of a body and soul, it is fitting that he should in both cases maintain both the holiness of the body, that is the abstention from shameful things, and the holiness of the soul keeping the faith pure and intact. For what use is it, Irenaeus writes, to know the truth in words, only to defile the body with evil deeds? Or what profit is it to seek the holiness of the body and to reject the church's teaching? In Irenaeus' thinking, these things must be held together in the process of sanctification. The Christian seeks sanctification and to refrain from shameful things and lawless deeds. The holiness of the soul, on the other hand, means that the Christian keeps the faith of God in whole, neither adding to it or subtracting to it. Tertullian describes the effect of this doctrinal moral teaching has upon the community. He says that this community appoints elders and appoints bishops who are established by character and virtue, not by monetary gain. There is no buying or selling of the things of God. Though we have our treasure chest, it is made up of tithes. On a monthly day, each puts in a small donation at his pleasure, and only if he is able. There is no compulsion. These gifts are piety's deposit fund, for they are taken then and not spent on feasts or drinking bouts or eating houses, but to support the poor, to supply the wants of boys or girls destitute of means, persons of old age confined to houses, those who have suffered shipwrecks, those who work in the mines or banished to the islands, those shut up in prisons, for nothing but their fidelity to the cause of Christ's church are the reason they do these things. The goodness of the church's doctrine and morality and the hope of this community are cherished when they treat each other like brothers and sisters and sacrificed for each other. We see a similar account in the writings of the 2nd century apologist Justin Martyr, who led a small school of Christian discipleship in Rome. In his first apology directed at the Emperor Antonius Pius, he argues that Christians are unjustly persecuted because of their name, because of their Christians. But by mere name, nothing is decided, Justin writes, either good or bad, apart from the actions that go along with a name. In other words, the name is a sign that signifies something else. In these things, Justin advocates, if you will just consider who Christians are and what they believe, you will find that they are a most excellent people. Justin defends their excellence by describing their worship service, which reads this: the wealthy among us help the needy. We all keep together. For all things we bless the Maker. On Sunday, everyone who lives in the city and everyone who lives in the countries gather together in one place. The memoirs of the apostles and the writings of the prophets are read. And as long as time permits, then the president instructs and exhorts everyone to these good things. They rise together, they pray, they take bread and wine, and they gather with prayers and thanksgivings. And there is a distribution sent to each, to all who are in need. Amid a pagan world, the worshiping community of Christians gathering and caring for the needs of others through worship and service. Second, when the church turned outward, we see the initial elements of the political and public theology, forged through persecution that demonstrated a good citizenship, serving the lowly, engaging the prevailing philosophical ideas. The church was not hiding away, but politically, socially, and intellectually engaged with the Greco-Roman world. In their worship service, Tertullian writes, "We read our sacred texts. We pray for our emperors, for their ministers, for all in authority, for the welfare of the world, for the prevalence of peace. There is no fear of political rulers because God is sovereign. And as Romans 13 states, God has actually placed that ruler in a position under his authority. At the same time, those outside the church see the goodness of the church on display. They see the way they cared for the poor. They see how that care served their apologetic and evangelistic functions. These pagans see how the church loved each other, called each other brothers and sisters, and saw themselves in a large way as both brothers and sisters with those outside the church. It is a natural and organic part of Tertullian's arguments and many of the other early Christian apologists to defend the goodness of the church for the world. Finally, we see all these things seem together in a short 2nd century apologetic text entitled The Epistle of Diognetus. The argument of this text defends Christianity against the false charges and uses an anthropological analogy of body and soul, arguing that just as the soul is in the body, the church is placed in the world. The epistle reads, Christians are not distinguished from the rest of humanity by country or language or custom. For nowhere do they live in cities of their own or speak some unusual dialect, nor do they practice an eccentric lifestyle. The teaching of Christianity has not been discovered or thought by thought or reflection of ingenious men, nor do they promote human doctrine. They live in Greek and barbarian cities, as each one's lot was cast. They follow the local customs of dress and food and other aspects of life. At the same time, they demonstrate the remarkable and admittedly unusual character of their own citizenship. They live in countries of their own, but only as aliens. They participate in everything as citizens, yet endure all things as foreigners. Every foreign country is their fatherland. Every fatherland is foreign. They marry like everyone else. They have children, but they do not expose their offspring. They share their food, but not their wives. They are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. They live on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey all the prescribed laws, but in their private lives, they transcend the laws. They love everyone, but by everyone they are persecuted. They are unknown, yet they are condemned. They are put to death, yet they are brought to life. They are poor, yet they make many rich. They are in need of everything, yet they abound in everything. They are dishonored, yet they glorify in their dishonor. They are slandered, yet they are vindicated. They are cursed, yet they bless. They are insulted, yet they offer respect. When they do good, they are punished as evildoers. When they are punished, they rejoice as though brought to life. The Jews assail them as foreigners. The Greeks persecute them, yet those who hate them are unable to give a reason for their hostility. In a word, what the soul is to the body, Christians are to the world. Such is the important position which God has appointed the church. It is not right for us to decline it. Throughout this section, we see the author has a profound sense of divine providence and simultaneously governing the church in the world, calling the church to fulfill the appointed ministry that has been entrusted to us. The epistle argues Christians are spread out to every known geographical region, but remain theologically and morally distinct from the world. They are not distinguished from humanity by their country or their language or their customs. The nature and the unity of the church is not those outward signs, but the union and communion with the Spirit. The people of God are held captive and persecuted, but ironically, as the epistle writes, they actually hold the world together. The church is, after all, the focal point of God's redemptive activity. the means through which God is redeeming the world. This is the point of the anthropological analogy. The soul is distinct from the body, but dispersed throughout it and animates the body, holds the body together. Christians are dispersed throughout the whole world, never confined to a particular geographical region or country, but through God's redemptive work, they are carrying out the essential activities of mission and evangelism and redemption. The author believes the church holds a very unique position in the world, marked out by their doctrine and their morality. These things were not discovered through the thought of ingenious men like philosophers or rhetoricians. These were appointed and directed by God, imparted to Christ through his apostles, handed down to the church. And the Christians' lives are marked out by a distinctive morality. The epistle argues that Christians demonstrate this remarkable and admittedly unusual citizenship. For the Christians, every foreign country is their fatherland, and every fatherland is foreign. They are simultaneously citizens of a country in which they reside and at the same time foreigners because their identity is rooted in Christ as King. This is not to say that they retreat or deny their citizenship. On the contrary, they live in their own countries and participate in everything as citizens, the epistle argues. For the early church, the Roman Empire is not a Christian nation. There are no special Christian political activities, no unique citizenship just for Christians, earthly citizenship just for Christians. Following the words of Paul, they accept the political authorities as appointed by God and they obey prescribed laws. Yet they form a citizenship that is qualified by a commitment to Christian doctrine and practice, and their understanding of earthly political rulers are all provisional and temporary as they await for the coming of Jesus Christ as King. When coupled with a political theology, this view towards the civic authorities, the church recognizes these good things. These are certainly interesting days in which we find ourselves. And there is no doubt that the culture is changing. In these moments, we are inundated with competing strategies that compel us in all kinds of directions. At times, strategies can be confusing and paralyzing for Christian communities. I think, however, as I've argued, that resonances between the ancient church and today, there is much wisdom that can be found in the ancient church and the culture and the community of faith that is grounded in striving and demonstrating Christianity as a public good. In these moments, I pray that the early church, just as the early church, we can turn inward and recognizing it's not just about a strategy, but about cultivating a commitment to Christian doctrine and Christian morality. The goodness of Christian doctrine and Christian morality in the end was simply not something that Rome could handle. When the church cultivated a public theology and a political theology, it demonstrated the goodness of Christianity, and so many found it appealing. I hope that we too, in this cultural moment, can heed the words of the Epistle of Diognetus and recognize the important position where God has placed us in the midst of this cultural moment. Just like the epistle argued, it is not right for us to decline it. Now to him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen.